Good evening. Welcome, friends. Today we are in Season 3, Episode 1 of Story Hour, and we shall be beginning She, A History of Adventure by H. Rider Haggard. This really came about because I think it was last week actually, Oxfam were running a sale, and I managed to pick up a couple of books which I had my eye on. One of them was William Morris's The House of the Wolfings, and the other was She by Rider Haggard. And I wanted these books because I knew that they had both, in different ways, been a significant influence upon J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and then with Haggard's book in particular, many others, including Edgar Rice Burroughs, Rudyard Kipling, Arthur Conan Doyle. That's because he was really one of the first, if not the first, to popularize the Lost World genre. And so today, we're not going to look at his most famous story, King Solomon's Mines, but one which maybe has had more impact. We're going to be reading She. And I shall begin with the prologue. So, I hope you're sitting comfortably, maybe you have a wee dram by your side, and let us begin. Prologue. In giving to the world the record of what, looked at as an adventure only, is I suppose one of the most wonderful and mysterious experiences ever undergone by mortal men, I feel it incumbent on me to explain my exact connection with it. And so I may as well say at once that I am not the narrator, but only the editor of this extraordinary history, and then go on to tell how it found its way into my hands. Some years ago I, the editor, was stopping with a friend, vir doctissimus et amicus meus, at a certain university, which for the purposes of this history we will call Cambridge, and one day was much struck with the appearance of two persons whom I saw walking arm in arm down the street. One of these gentlemen was, I think without exception, the handsomest young fellow I have ever seen. He was very tall, very broad, and had a look of power and a grace of bearing that seemed as native to him as to a wild stag. In addition to his face was almost without flaw, a good face as well as a beautiful one, and when he lifted his hat, which he did just then to a passing lady, I saw that his head was covered with little golden curls growing close to the scalp. Good gracious, I said to my friend, with whom I was walking. Why, that fellow looks like a statue of Apollo come to life. What a splendid man he is. Yes, he answered, he is the handsomest fellow in the university, and one of the nicest too. They call him the Greek god. But look at the other one. He is Vinces, that's the god's name, guardian, and supposed to be full of every kind of information. They call him Charon, either because of his forbidding appearance, or because he has ferried his ward across the deep waters of examination. I don't know which. I looked, and found the older man quite as interesting in his way as the glorified specimen of humanity at his side. He appeared to be about 40 years of age, and I think just as ugly as his companion was handsome. To begin with, he was short, rather bow-legged, very deep-chested, and with unusually long arms. He had dark hair and small eyes, and the hair grew down on his forehead, and his whiskers grew quite up to his hair, so that there was an uncommonly little of his countenance to be seen. Altogether, he reminded me forcibly of a gorilla, and yet there was something very pleasing and genial about the man's eye. I remember saying that I should like to know him. All right, answered my friend. Nothing easier. I know Vincey. I'll introduce you. And he did. and for some minutes we stood chatting. About the Zulu people, I think, for I had just returned from the Cape at that time. Presently, however, a stout lady, whose name I do not remember, came along the pavement, accompanied by a pretty fair-haired girl, and Mr. Vincey, who clearly knew them well, at once joined these two, walking off in their company. I remember being rather amused because of the change in the expression of the elder man, whose name I discovered was Holly, when he saw the ladies advancing. He suddenly stopped short in his talk, cast a reproachful look at his companion, and, with an abrupt nod to myself, turned and marched off alone across the street. I heard afterwards that he was popularly supposed to be as much afraid of a woman as most people are of a mad dog, which accounted for his precipitate retreat. I cannot say, however, that young Vincey showed much aversion to feminine society on this occasion. Indeed, I remember laughing and remarking to my friend at the time that he was not the sort of man whom it would be desirable to introduce to the lady one was going to marry, since it was exceedingly probable that the acquaintance would end in a transfer of her affections. He was altogether too good looking, and, what is more, he had none of that consciousness and conceit about him which usually afflicts handsome men, and makes them deservedly disliked by their fellows. That same evening my visit came to an end, and this was the last I saw or heard of Charon and the Greek god for many a long day. Indeed, I have never seen either of them from that hour to this, and do not think it probable that I shall. But a month ago, I received a letter and two packets, one of a manuscript, and on opening the former found that it was signed by Horace Holly, a name that at the moment was not familiar to me. It ran as follows: College, Cambridge, May the 1st, 18. My dear Sir, you will be surprised, considering the very slight nature of our acquaintance, to get a letter from me. Indeed, I think I had better begin by reminding you that we once met, now several years ago, when I and my ward Leo Vincey were introduced to you in the street at Cambridge. To be brief and come to my business, I have recently read with much interest a book of yours describing a Central African adventure. I take it that this book is partly true, and partly an effort of the imagination. However this may be, it has given me an idea. It happens, how you will see in the accompanying manuscript, which together with the scarab, the royal son of the sun, and the original shirt I am sending to you by hand, that my ward, or rather my adopted son Leo Vincey and myself, have recently passed through a real African adventure, of a nature so much more marvellous than the one which you describe, that to tell the truth, I am almost ashamed to submit it to you, lest you should disbelieve my tale. You will see it stated in this manuscript that I, or rather we, had made up our minds not to make this history public during our joint lives. Nor should we alter our determination were it not for a circumstance which has recently arisen. For reasons that, after perusing this manuscript, you may be able to guess, we are going away again, this time to Central Asia, where, if anywhere upon this earth, wisdom is to be found, and we anticipate that our sojourn there will be a long one. Possibly we shall not return. Under these altered conditions, it has become a question whether we are justified in withholding from the world an account of a phenomenon which we believe to be of unparalleled interest, merely because our private life is involved, or because we are afraid of ridicule and doubt being cast upon our statements. I hold one view about this matter, and Leo holds another. And finally, after much discussion, we have come to a compromise, namely, to send the history to you, giving you full leave to publish it if you think fit, the only stipulation being that you shall disguise our real names, and as much concerning our personal identity as is consistent with the maintenance of the bona fides of the narrative. And now what am I to say further? I really do not know, beyond once more repeating that everything is described in the accompanying manuscript exactly as it happened. As regards she herself, I have nothing to add. Day by day we have greater occasion to regret that we did not better avail ourselves of our opportunities to obtain more information from that marvellous woman. Who was she? How did she first come to the caves of Kor? And what was her real religion? We never ascertained, and now, alas, we never shall, at least not yet. These and many other questions arise in my mind, but what is the good of asking them now? Will you undertake the task? We give you complete freedom, and as a reward you will, we believe, have the credit of presenting to the world the most wonderful history, as distinguished from romance, that its records can show. Read the manuscript, which I have copied out fairly for your benefit, and let me know. Believe me, very truly yours, L. Horace Holly. P.S. Of course, if any profit results from the sale of the writing, should you care to undertake its publication, you can do what you like with it. But if there is a loss, I will leave instructions with my lawyers, Messrs. Jeffrey and Jordan, to meet it. We entrust the sherd, the scarab, and the parchments to your keeping, till such time as we demand them back again. L.H.H. This letter, as may be imagined, astonished me considerably. But when I came to look at the manuscript, which the pressure of the other work prevented me from doing for a fortnight, I was still more astonished, as I think the reader will be also, and at once made up my mind to press on with the matter. I wrote to this effect to Mr. Holly, but a week afterwards received a letter from the gentleman's lawyers, returning my own, with the information that their client and Mr. Leo Vincey had already left the country for Tibet, and they did not at present know their address. Well, that is all I have to say. Of the history itself, the reader may judge. I give it him, with the exception of a very few alterations, made with the object of concealing the identity of the actors from the general public, exactly as it has come to me. Personally, I have made up my mind to refrain from comments. At first I was inclined to believe that this history of a woman on whom, clothed in the majesty of her almost endless years, the shadow of eternity itself lay like the dark wing of night, was some gigantic allegory of which I could not catch the meaning. Then I thought that it might be a bold attempt to portray the possible results of practical immortality, informing the substance of a mortal who yet drew her strength from the earth, and in whose human bosom passions yet rose and fell and beat, as in the undying world around her the winds and the tides rise and fall and beat unceasingly. But as I went on, I abandoned that idea also. To me, the story seems to bear the stamp of truth upon its face. Its explanation I must leave to others, and with this slight preface, which circumstances make necessary, I introduce the world to Asha and the Caves of Kor. The Editor. P.S. There is on consideration one circumstance that, after a reperusal of this history, struck me with so much force that I cannot resist calling the attention of the reader to it. He will observe that so far as we are made acquainted with him, there appears to be nothing in the character of Leo Vinci which, in the opinion of most people, would have been likely to attract an intellect so powerful as that of Asher. He is not even, at any rate to my view, particularly interesting. Indeed, one might imagine that Mr. Holly would, under ordinary circumstances, have easily outstripped him in the favour of she. Can it be that extremes meet, and that the very excess and splendour of her mind led her by means of some strange physical reaction to worship at the shrine of matter? Was that ancient Callicrates nothing but a splendid animal beloved for his hereditary Greek beauty? Or is the true explanation what I believe it to be, namely, that Asha, seeing further than we can see, perceived the germ and smouldering spark of greatness which lay hid within her lover's soul, and well knew that under the influence of her gift of life, watered by her wisdom, and shone upon with the sunshine of her presence, it would bloom like a flower and flash out like a star, filling the world with light and fragrance? Here also I am not able to answer, but must leave the reader to form his own judgment on the facts before him, as detailed by Mr. Holly in the following pages. Chapter 1. My Visitor. There are some events of which each circumstance and surrounding detail seems to be graven on the memory in such fashion that we cannot forget it, and so it is with the scene that I am about to describe. It rises as clearly before my mind at this moment as though it had happened yesterday. It was in this very month, something over 20 years ago, that I, Ludwig Horace Holly, was sitting one night in my rooms at Cambridge, grinding away at some mathematical work. I forget what. I was to go up for my fellowship within a week, and was expected by my tutor and my college generally to distinguish myself. At last, wearied out, I flung my book down and, going to the mantelpiece, took up a pipe and filled it. There was a candle burning on the mantelpiece, and a long, narrow glass at the back of it. And as I was in the act of lighting the pipe, I caught sight of my own countenance in the glass, and paused to reflect. The lighted match burnt away till it scorched my fingers, forcing me to drop it. But still I stood and stared at myself in the glass, and reflected. Well, I said aloud at last, it is to be hoped that I shall be able to do something with the inside of my head, for I shall certainly never do anything by the help of the outside. This remark will doubtless strike anybody who reads it as being slightly obscure, but I was in reality alluding to my physical deficiencies. Most men of 22 are endowed at any rate with some share of the comeliness of youth, but to me even this was denied. Short, thick-set, and deep-chested almost to deformity, with long sinewy arms, heavy features, deep-set grey eyes, a low brow half overgrown with a mop of thick black hair, like a deserted clearing on which the forest had once more begun to encroach. Such was my appearance nearly a quarter of a century ago, and such, with some modification, is it to this day. Like Cain, I was branded by nature with the stamp of abnormal ugliness, as I was gifted by nature with iron and abnormal strength and considerable intellectual powers. So ugly was I that the spruce young men of my college, though they were proud enough of my feats of endurance and physical prowess, did not care even to be seen walking with me. Was it wonderful that I was misanthropic and sullen? Was it wonderful that I brooded and worked alone and had no friends? At least, only one. I was set apart by nature to live alone and draw comfort from her breast and hers only. Women hated the sight of me. Only a week before I had heard one call me a monster when she thought I was out of hearing, and say that I had converted her to the monkey theory. Once, indeed, a woman pretended to care for me, and I lavished all the pent-up affection of my nature upon her. Then money that was to have come to me went elsewhere, and she discarded me. I pleaded with her as I have never pleaded with any living creature before or since, for I was caught by her sweet face, and I loved her. And in the end, by way of answer, she took me to the glass and stood side by side with me and looked into it. Now, she said, if I am beauty, who are you? That was when I was only 20. And so I stood and stared and felt a sort of grim satisfaction in the sense of my own loneliness. For I had neither father, nor mother, nor brother, and as I did so there came a knock at the door. I listened before I went to open it, for it was nearly 12 o'clock at night, and I was in no mood to admit any stranger. I had but one friend in the college, or indeed in the world. Perhaps it was he. Just then the person outside the door coughed, and I hastened to open it, for I knew the cough. A tall man of about 30, with the remains of a great personal beauty, came hurrying in, staggering beneath the weight of a massive iron box, which he carried by a handle with his right hand. He placed the box upon the table, and then fell into an awful fit of coughing. He coughed and he coughed till his face became quite purple, and at last he sank into a chair and began to spit up blood. I poured out some whisky into a tumbler and gave it to him. He drank it and seemed better, though his better was very bad indeed. "Why did you keep me standing there in the cold?" he asked pettishly. "You know the draughts are death to me." "I did not know who it was," I answered. "You are a late visitor." "Yes, and verily I believe it is my last visit," he answered, with a ghastly attempt at a smile. "I am done for, Holly. I am done for. I do not believe that I shall see tomorrow." "Nonsense," I said. "Let me go for a doctor." He waved me back imperiously with his hand. "It is sober sense, but I want no doctors. I have studied medicine and I know all about it. No doctors can help me. My last hour has come. For a year past, I have only lived by a miracle. Now listen to me as you've never listened to anybody before, for you will not have the opportunity of getting me to repeat my words. We have been friends for 2 years. Now tell me, how much do you know about me? I know that you are rich, and have had a fancy to come to the college long after the age that most men leave it. I know that you have been married, and that your wife died, and that you have been the best, indeed almost the only friend I've ever had. Did you know that I have a son? No, I have. He is 5 years old. He cost me his mother's life, and I have never been able to bear to look upon his face in consequence. Holly, if you will accept the trust, I am going to leave you that boy's sole guardian. I sprang almost out of my chair. Me? I said. Yes, you. I have not studied you for 2 years for nothing. I have known for some time that I could not last, and since I realized the fact, I have been searching for someone to whom I could confide the boy and this, and he tapped the iron box. You are the man, Holly, for like a rugged tree, you are hard and sound at core. Listen, the boy will be the only representative of one of the most ancient families in the world. That is, so far as families can be traced. You will laugh at me when I say it, but one day it will be proved to you beyond a doubt that my 65th or 66th lineal ancestor was an Egyptian priest of Isis, though he himself was a Grecian extraction and was called Callicrates. His father was one of the Greek mercenaries raised by Haggard, a Mendician pharaoh of 29th dynasty, and his grandfather, or great-grandfather, I believe, was that very Callicrates mentioned by Herodotus. In or about the year 339 before Christ, just at the time of the final fall of the pharaohs, this Callicrates, the priest, broke his vows of celibacy and fled from Egypt with a princess of royal blood who had fallen in love with him and was finally wrecked upon the coast of Africa, somewhere, as I believe, in the neighborhood of where Delagoa Bay now is, or rather to the north of it, he and his wife being saved, and all the remainder of their company destroyed in one way or another. Here they endured great hardships, but were at last entertained by the mighty queen of a savage people, a white woman of peculiar loveliness, who, under circumstances which I cannot enter into, but which you will one day learn, if you live, from the contents of the box, finally murdered my ancestor Callicrates. His wife, however, escaped, how I know not, to Athens, bearing a child with her, whom she named Tisithenes, or the Mighty Avenger. 500 years or more afterwards, the family migrated to Rome under circumstances of which no trace remains, and here, probably with the idea of preserving the idea of vengeance which we find set out in the name of Tisithenes, they appear to have pretty regularly assumed the cognomen of Vindex, or Avenger. Here, too, they remained for another 5 centuries or more, till about AD 770, when Charlemagne invaded Lombardy, where they were then settled, whereon the head of the family seems to have attached himself to the great emperor, and to have returned with him across the Alps, and finally to have settled in Brittany. 8 generations later, his lineal representative crossed to England in the reign of Edward the Confessor, and in the time of William the Conqueror was advanced to great honour and power. From that time to the present day, I can trace my descent without a break. Not that Vinces, for that was the final corruption of the name after its bearers took root in English soil, have been particularly distinguished. They never came much to the fore. Sometimes they were soldiers, sometimes merchants, but on the whole, they have preserved a dead level of respectability and a still deader level of mediocrity. From the time of Charles II till the beginning of the present century, they were merchants. About 1790, my grandfather made a considerable fortune out of brewing and retired. In 1821, he died, and my father succeeded him and dissipated most of the money. 10 years ago, he died also, leaving me a net income of about 2,000 a year. Then it was that I undertook an expedition in connection with that, and he pointed to the iron chest, which ended disastrously enough. On my way back, I travelled in the south of Europe and finally reached Athens. There I met my beloved wife, who might well also have been called the Beautiful, like my old Greek ancestor. There I married her, and there, after a year, when my boy was born, she died. He paused a while, his head sunk upon his hand, and then continued. My marriage had diverted me from a project which I cannot enter into now. I have no time, Holly. I have no time. One day, if you accept my trust, you will learn all about it. After my wife's death, I turned my mind to it again. But first, it was necessary, or at least I conceived that it was necessary, that I should attain to a perfect knowledge of Eastern dialects, especially Arabic. It was to facilitate my studies that I came here. Very soon, however, my disease developed itself, and now there is an end of me. And as though to emphasize his words, he burst into another terrible fit of coughing. I gave him some more whiskey, and after resting, he went on. I have never seen my boy, Leo, since he was a tiny baby. I could never bear to see him, but they tell me that he is a quick and handsome child. In this envelope, and he produced a letter from his pocket addressed to myself, I have jotted down the course I wish followed in the boy's education. It is a somewhat peculiar one. At any rate, I could not entrust it to a stranger. Once more, will you undertake it? I must first know what I am to undertake, I answered. You are to undertake to have the boy, Leo, to live with you till he is 25 years of age, not to send him to school, remember. On his 25th birthday, your guardianship will end, and you will then, with the keys that I give you now, and he placed them on the table, open the iron box and let him see and read the contents and say whether or no he is willing to undertake the quest. There is no obligation on him to do so. Now, as regards terms, my present income is 2,200 a year. Half of that income I have secured to you by will for life, contingently on your undertaking the guardianship. That is 1,000 a year remuneration to yourself, for you will have to give up your life to it, and 100 a year to pay for the board of the boy. The rest is to accumulate till Leo is 25, so that there may be a sum in hand, should he wish to undertake the quest of which I spoke. And suppose I were to die, I asked. Then the boy must become a ward of Chancery and take his chance. Only be careful that the iron chest is passed on to him by your will. Listen, Holly, don't refuse me. Believe me, this is to your advantage. You are not fit to mix with the world. It would only embitter you. In a few weeks, you will become a fellow of your college, and the income which you will derive from that, combined with what I have left you, will enable you to live a life of learned leisure, alternated with the sport of which you are so fond, such as will exactly suit you." He paused and looked at me anxiously, but I still hesitated. The charge seemed so very strange. "For my sake, Holly, we have been good friends, and I have no time to make other arrangements." "Very well," I said. "I will do it, provided that there is nothing in this paper to make me change my mind." And I touched the envelope he had put upon the table by the keys. "Thank you, Ollie, thank you. There is nothing at all. Swear to me by God that you will be a father to the boy and follow my directions to the letter." "I swear it," I answered solemnly. "Very well. Remember that perhaps one day I shall ask for the account of your oath, for though I am dead and forgotten, yet shall I live. There is no such thing as death, Holly, only a change, and, as you perhaps may learn in time to come, I believe that even here that change could under certain circumstances be indefinitely postponed." And again he broke into one of his dreadful fits of coughing. "There," he said, "I must go. You have the chest, and my will can be found among my papers, under the authority of which the child will be handed over to you. You will be well paid, Holly, and I know that you are honest. But if you betray my trust, by heaven, I will haunt you." I said nothing, being, indeed, too bewildered to speak. He held up the candle and looked at his own face in the glass. It had been a beautiful face, but disease had wrecked it. "Food for worms," he said. "Curious to think that in a few hours I shall be stiff and cold. The journey done, the little game played out. Ah, me, Ollie, life is not worth the trouble of life, except one is in love. At least, mine has not been. But the boy, Leo's, may be if he has the courage and the faith. Goodbye, my friend." And with a sudden access of tenderness, he flung his arm about me and kissed me on the forehead, and then turned to go. "Look here, Vincey," I said. "If you are as ill as you think, you'd better let me fetch a doctor." "No, no," he said earnestly. "Promise me that you won't. I am going to die, and, like a poisoned rat, I wish to die alone." "I don't believe that you are going to do anything of the sort," I answered. He smiled, and, with the word "remember" on his lips, he was gone. As for myself, I sat down and rubbed my eyes, wondering if I had been asleep. As this supposition would not bear investigation, I gave it up, and began to think that Vincey must have been drinking. I knew that he was, and had been very ill, but still it seemed impossible that he could be in such a condition as to be able to know for certain that he would not outlive the night. Had he been so near dissolution, surely he would scarcely have been able to walk, and carry a heavy iron box with him. The story, on reflection, seemed to me utterly incredible, for I was not then old enough to be aware how many things happen in this world that the common sense of the average man would set down as so improbable as to be absolutely impossible. This is a fact that I have only recently mastered. Was it likely that a man would have a son 5 years of age whom he had never seen since he was a tiny infant? No. Was it likely that he could foretell his own death so accurately? No. Was it likely that he could trace his pedigree for more than 3 centuries before Christ, or that he would suddenly confide the absolute guardianship of his child and leave half his fortune to a college friend? Most certainly not. Clearly, Vincey was either drunk or mad. That being so, what did it mean? And what was in the sealed iron chest? The whole thing baffled and puzzled me to such an extent that at last I could bear it no longer and determined to sleep it over. So I jumped up, having put the keys and the letter that Vincey had left away into my dispatch box and hidden the iron chest in a large portmanteau. I went to bed and was soon fast asleep. As it seemed to me, I had only been asleep for a few minutes when I was awakened by somebody calling me. I sat up and rubbed my eyes. It was broad daylight, 8 o'clock, in fact. "Why, what is the matter with you, John?" I asked of the gyp who waited on Vincey and myself. "You look as though you had seen a ghost." "Yes, sir, and so I have," he answered. "Leastways, I've seen a corpse, which is worse. I've been in to call Mr. Vincey, as usual, and there he lies stark and dead." Chapter 2. The years roll by. As might be expected, poor Vincey's sudden death created a great stir in the college. But, as he was known to be very ill, and a satisfactory doctor's certificate was forthcoming, there was no inquest. They were not so particular about inquests in those days as they are now. Indeed, they were generally disliked because of the scandal. Under all these circumstances, being asked no questions, I did not feel called upon to volunteer any information about our interview on the night of Vincey's decease, beyond saying that he had come into my rooms to see me, as he often did. On the day of the funeral, a lawyer came down from London and followed my poor friend's remains to the grave, and then went back with his papers and effects, except, of course, the iron chest which had been left in my keeping. For a week after this I heard no more of the matter, and, indeed, my attention was amply occupied in other ways, for I was up for my fellowship, a fact that had prevented me from attending the funeral or seeing the lawyer. At last, however, the examination was over, and I came back to my rooms and sank into an easy chair with a happy consciousness that I had got through it very fairly. Soon, however, my thoughts, relieved of the pressure that had crushed them into a single groove during the last few days, turned to the events of the night of poor Vincey's death, and again I asked myself what it all meant, and wondered if I should hear anything more of the matter, and if I did not, what it would be my duty to do with the curious iron chest. I sat there and thought till I began to grow quite disturbed over the whole occurrence. The mysterious midnight visit, the prophecy of death so shortly to be fulfilled, the solemn oath that I had taken, and which Vincey had called on me to answer to in another world than this. Had the man committed suicide? It looked like it. And what was the quest of which he spoke? The circumstances were uncanny, so much so that, though I am by no means nervous, or apt to be alarmed at anything that may seem to cross the bounds of the natural, I grew afraid and began to wish I had nothing to do with them. How much more do I wish it now, over 20 years afterwards? As I sat and thought, there came a knock at the door, and a letter, in a big blue envelope, was brought in to me. I saw at a glance that it was a lawyer's letter, and an instinct told me that it was connected with my trust. The letter, which I still have, runs thus: Sir, our client, the late M. L. Vincey, Esquire, who died on the 9th in Cambridge, has left behind him a will, of which you will please find copy enclosed, and of which we are the executors. Under this will you will perceive that you take a life interest in about half of the late Mr. Vincey's property, now invested in consols, subject to your acceptance of the guardianship of his only son, Leo Vincey, at present an infant, aged 5. Had we not ourselves drawn up the document in question in obedience to Mr. Vincey's clear and precise instructions, both personal and written, and had he not then assured us that he had very good reasons for what he was doing, we are bound to tell you that its provisions seem to us of so unusual a nature that we should have felt bound to call the attention of the Court of Chancery to them, in order that such steps might be taken as seemed desirable to it, either by contesting the capacity of the testator or otherwise, to safeguard the interests of the infant. As it is, knowing that the testator was a gentleman of the highest intelligence and acumen, and that he has absolutely no relations living to whom he could have confided the guardianship of the child, we do not feel justified in taking this course. Awaiting such instructions as you please to send us as regards the delivery of the infant and the payment of the proportion of dividends due to you, we remain, sir, faithfully yours, Geoffrey and Jordan. Horace L. Holly, Esquire. I put down the letter and ran my eye through the will, which appeared, from its utter unintelligibility, to have been drawn on the strictest legal principles. So far as I could discover, however, it exactly bore out what my friend Vincey had told me on the night of his death. So it was true after all. I must take the boy. Suddenly I remembered the letter which Vincey had left with the chest. I fetched and opened it. It only contained such directions as he had already given to me as to opening the chest on Leo's 25th birthday, and laid down the outlines of the boy's education, which was to include Greek, the higher mathematics, and Arabic. At the end there was a proscript to the effect that if the boy died under the age of 25, which, however, he did not believe would be the case, I was to open the chest and act on the information I obtained if I saw fit. If I did not see fit, I was to destroy all the contents. On no account was I to pass them on to a stranger. As this letter added nothing material to my knowledge, and certainly raised no further objection in my mind to entering on the task I had promised my dead friend to undertake, there was only one course open to me, namely, to write to Messrs. Geoffrey and Jordan and express my acceptance of the trust, stating I should be willing to commence my guardianship of Leo in 10 days' time. This done, I went to the authorities of my college, and, having told them as much of the story as I considered desirable, which was not very much, after considerable difficulty, succeeded in persuading them to stretch a point, and, in the event of my having obtained a fellowship, which I was pretty certain I had done, allow me to have the child to live with me. Their consent, however, was only granted on the condition that I vacated my rooms in college and took lodgings. This I did, and with some difficulty succeeded in obtaining very good apartments quite close to the college gates. The next thing was to find a nurse, and on this point I came to a determination. I would have no woman to lord it over me about the child, and steal his affections from me. The boy was old enough to do without female assistance, so I set to work to hunt up a suitable male attendant. With some difficulty I succeeded in hiring a most respectable, round-faced young man, who had been a helper in a hunting stable, but who said that he was one of a family of 17 and well accustomed to the ways of children, and professed himself quite willing to undertake the charge of Master Leo when he arrived. Then, having taken the iron box to town, and with my own hands deposited it at my banker's, I bought some books upon the health and management of children, and read them, first to myself, and then aloud to Job. That was the young man's name, and waited. At length, the child arrived in the charge of an elderly person, who wept bitterly at parting with him, and a beautiful boy he was. Indeed, I do not think that I ever saw such a perfect child before or since. His eyes were grey, his forehead was broad, and his face, even at that early age, clean cut as cameo, without being pinched or thin. But perhaps his most attractive point was his hair, which was pure gold in colour and tightly curled over his shapely head. He cried a little when his nurse finally tore herself away and left him with us. Never shall I forget the scene. There he stood, with the sunlight from the window playing upon his golden curls, his fist screwed over one eye, while he took us in with the other. I was seated in a chair, and stretched out my hand to him to induce him to come to me, while Job, in the corner, was making a sort of clucking noise, which, arguing from his previous experience, or from the analogy of the hen, he judged it would have a soothing effect and inspire confidence in the youthful mind, and running a wooden horse of peculiar hideousness backwards and forwards in a way that was little short of inane. This went on for some minutes, and then all of a sudden the lad stretched out both his little arms and ran to me. "I like you," he said. "You is ugly, but you is good." 10 minutes afterwards, he was eating large slices of bread and butter, with every sign of satisfaction. Job wanted to put jam onto them, but I sternly reminded him of the excellent works that we had read, and forbade it. In a very little while, for, as I expected, I got my fellowship, the boy became the favourite of the whole college, where, all orders and regulations to the contrary notwithstanding, he was continually in and out, a sort of chartered libertine, in whose favour all rules were relaxed. The offerings made at his shrine were simply without number, and I had a serious difference of opinion with one old resident fellow, now long dead, who was usually supposed to be the crustiest man in the university, and to abhor the sight of a child. And yet I discovered, when a frequently recurring fit of sickness had forced Job to keep a strict lookout, that this unprincipled old man was in the habit of enticing the boy to his rooms, and there feeding him upon unlimited quantities of brandy balls, and making him promise to say nothing about it. Job told him that he ought to be ashamed of himself. At his age too, when he might have been a grandfather, if he had done what was right, by which Job understood had got married, and thence arose the quarrel. But I have no space to dwell upon those delightful years, around which memory still hovers fondly. One by one they went by, and as they passed we too grew dearer and yet more dear to each other. Few sons have been loved as I love Leo, and few fathers know the deep and continuous affection that Leo bears to me. The child grew into the boy, and the boy into the young man, while one by one the remorseless years flew by. And as he grew and increased, so did his beauty, and the beauty of his mind grew with him. When he was about 15, they used to call him Beauty around the college, and me they nicknamed the Beast. Beauty and the Beast was what they called us when we went out walking together, as we used to do every day. Once Leo attacked a great strapping butcher's man, twice his size, because he sang it out after us, and thrashed him too, thrashed him fairly. I walked on and pretended not to see, till the combat got too exciting, when I turned round and cheered him on to victory. It was the chaff of the college at the time, but I could not help it. Then, when he was a little older, the undergraduates found fresh names for us. They called me Charon, and Leo the Greek god. I will pass over my own appellation with the humble remark that I was never handsome, and did not grow more so as I grew older. As for his, there was no doubt about its fitness. Leo at 21 might have stood for a statue of the youthful Apollo. I never saw anybody to touch him in looks, or anybody so absolutely unconscious of them. As for his mind, he was brilliant and keen-witted, but not a scholar. He had not the dullness necessary to that result. We followed out his father's instructions as regards his early education strictly enough, and on the whole the results, especially in the matters of Greek and Arabic, were satisfactory. I learnt the latter language in order to help to teach it to him, but after 5 years of it he knew it as well as I did, almost as well as the professor instructed us both. I always was a great sportsman. It was my one passion, and every autumn we went away somewhere shooting or fishing, sometimes to Scotland, sometimes to Norway, once even to Russia. I am a good shot, but even in this he learned to excel me. When Leo was 18, I moved back into my rooms and entered him at my own college, and at 21 he took his degree, a respectable degree, but not a very high one. Then it was that, for the first time, I told him something of his own story, and of the mystery that loomed ahead. Of course he was very curious about it, and of course I explained to him that his curiosity could not be gratified at present. After that, to pass the time away, I suggested that he should get himself called to the bar, and this he did, reading at Cambridge, and only going up to London to eat his dinners. I had only one trouble about him, and that was that every young woman who came across him, or if not every one, nearly so, would insist on falling in love with him. Hence arose difficulties, which I need not enter into here, though they were troublesome enough at the time. On the whole, he behaved fairly well. I cannot say more than that. And so the time went by till at last he reached his 25th birthday, at which date this strange and in some ways awful history really begins. Well, that is us just at the hour, my friends. We have just begun an exciting tale, and we leave at a point of suspense where we will discover the beginnings of this mysterious adventure at some point in the future. Thank you for joining me for this hour. It has been a pleasure to share this story with you, the beginnings of it, and I hope that you'll be able to join me for future episodes. Next week on the channel, it is back to English restoration. We'll be joined by Rupert August, hopefully daughter of Albion, and a wonderful guest, Scott Mannion, to discuss the concept, Tolkien's idea of northern courage. In the meantime, this has been Story Hour. May God bless you wherever you are, whoever you are, and good night.